Yeah. Maybe just the keywords. That's all it takes now.
Yeah, hasn't got, we have, hasn't got the distribution, should have really. Lots of people talking already.
Well, there was talk about, in the early days of the energy initiative, having it as a textbook for engineers, professional, well, some kind of course.
It's too boring.
Are you going to remember to acknowledge?
Got it on my list.
That's must do at QUT also, definitely. He says in a non-committal third person kind of way. Yeah.
Are we recording now? Is it just online?
It's 7 o'clock, is it?
6.
6 o'clock.
Oh, 6 or 1 actually. 2 minutes. And I won't wear the thing, I'll just stand here.
Okay.
Yeah, you can take that.
You can put it on. Put on the wearable
Yeah,
one.
just put it on.
And do I have to turn it on?
No, Christine, do you turn that on or does it go on? Does he do
It's
it?
probably a button.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's all.
Nearly.
Yeah, sure.
When he sits down, we're done. Hello there. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to kick off because we started paying for the room a couple of minutes ago, so we have to get our money's worth. Thank you again for coming to another of our UQ Energy Express seminars. Before I go any further, just the brief on safety for the room. There's no drills or anything planned tonight, so if it goes off, it's the real thing. If you can keep up with us, you'll follow us up the stairs there, or out of one of these 2 doors here, and we meet, if we have a muster point, it's out in the Great Court in the area there. With that said, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to our elders past, present and emerging. Now tonight we've got an interesting topic from Rob here. He's going to talk to us about Uberizing energy, how digital technologies will change the competitive landscape and the energy sector. But before I do that, I have a book here about him to read, an entire biography. It doesn't have your date of birth on, but
Happy to add it.
So Rob's been with QUT since 2011, and prior to that, he was with Shell International E&P, and so was I, although we never ran into each other, I don't think. He left Shell, he worked in the University of Cambridge as an industrial research fellow, joined Shell again in 2014. There's a bit of a parallel there as well. You sort of leave and then you come back again. Yeah. And he became the company's executive coordinator for R&D. He's a Bachelor of Engineering in Mechanical Engineering from McMaster's University in Canada. He's got a master's degree in technology and policy from MIT and a PhD in engineering from the University of Cambridge, where he was a Gates Cambridge Scholar. He's a fellow of UK's Institute of Mechanical Engineers, Engineers Australia, and also a chartered engineer in Europe. He's a member of the UN Resources and Energy Expert Group, technical advisor for MIT's Mining, Oil and Gas Club, and several other energy and resource startups. He also works for the Australian government on an ad hoc basis, member of an expert network, and his duties in that role include providing advice about the energy industry and emerging innovations. So with that, could you put your hands together and welcome Rob, and then we'll take it away.
All right, so just housekeeping stuff here. So the altitude that I've got the microphone set at, is that about, it sounds about right? Not too, okay, great. So I also owe you a word of explanation on the front end. None of us could find a glass for me to sip from while I'm giving this talk. So you're going to be looking at me kind of just slurping away here from this 2-liter bottle, and you're going to look and think, my God, what kind of animal is this? This was just a necessity thing. So either I'm kind of, trying to push the words through a completely parched throat, or I'm guzzling from a 2-liter bottle. Those are the options. I'm going to kind of err on that side here. So I apologize in advance if it's a bit gauche. Okay, the topic, Uberizing energy. I'd like to start by just investing a couple of seconds on, there it is, thank you. A couple of seconds on explaining what do I mean by each of those 2 words that I'm starting off with. Uberizing, obviously I'm running around town now making up new words. I owe you an explanation as to what I mean by that, and that is coming in only a few slides, so bear with me on that one. Energy. I want to kind of make sure we have kind of a shared understanding of what we all mean before we kind of start down this path together. I am not failing to realize where I am. This is a community that I suspect many of you, including Alf, are very much invested in working on coal seam gas types of issues and challenges. And this narrative is very much inclusive of that. However, I'm also of the belief that that human civilization, we're kind of making some important transitions to different types of energy, greener, cleaner, less carbon intensive. And I think that much of the narrative that I'll be sharing with you today, even though that a lot of the evidence and a lot of the talking is kind of rooted quite firmly in oil and gas stuff, I think that a lot of this is also transferable over to post-fossil fuel kinds of stuff. So when I say energy, I mean that in a fairly inclusive way that is at once relevant, I think, to what's happening in the fossil fuel domain, because that's clearly where we are, that's where the market is. We can't stick our head in the ground and ignore that. But at the same time, I think it also sheds a useful amount of light about other parts of the energy network also. The obligatory slide about who am I, there's a few reasons why this is a great thing to do. One, having left Shell and have been a career academic now for 8 years, I'm extremely narcissistic and love to talk about me. So I'd like to invest just a couple seconds telling you all about myself. But more important than that even is that I've had a lot of turns and twists in my professional journey that I think probably are useful in explaining why this situation looks to me the way that it does. The part that Alf already alluded to is I was with Shell International. I cut my teeth with them, kind of learned the ropes in the more traditional aspects of the oil and gas industry. But later on in my Shell journey, there were a couple of other things that happened. One, this job in The Hague, I was executive coordinator of global R&D for the upstream portfolio. And what that allowed me to do is have kind of like this Vista-like, kind of this big picture perspective on how technology happens in the industry. And that was very informative and useful. And I also did about 4.5 years with working with the Smart Fields team, which was Shell's brand of digital oil fields of the future. And, Chevron had iFields, and, all the majors kind of had their own special shape and size of digital oil fields of the future, and Smart Fields was Shell's version of that. So at that point already, I was starting to kind of do a lot of thinking and a lot of working, kind of looking at that intersection of digital plus energy. And then when I got to QUT, one of the first things that they put in front of me was they said, hey, Rob, I know we didn't kind of lure you in for this particular job, but we have a bit of a situation here. We've got this endowed chair, PwC. We've got this new thing called the PwC Chair in Digital Economy. Well, the truth of the matter is, Rob, we just don't have anyone to kind of do the job for the moment. Would you mind kind of taking one for the team and being the PwC Chair in Digital Economy just for a year, just while we kind of, we'll kind of use you as a talking head, and then we'll kind of go find someone else who's actually good at the job, and then we'll kind of swap you out after that. And I was like, well, I don't actually have a deep experience, and I'm not the guy, I'm not the go-to guy in everything digital. I don't know that I'm your strongest choice. And they're like, no, it's just for a year, just do this. But what that job allowed me to do, again, was to kind of immerse myself in all kinds of digital types of conversations and talking to people who are very much on the bow wave of the trends that are unfolding in that part of the marketplace. And that kind of gave rise to some really interesting projects. I started getting into bed with companies like Microsoft and Intel, because as much as folks in the energy sector like to think and talk about the stuff that's on the digital aspects of the marketplace that we want to import, similarly, there's people in Microsoft and Intel that are very eager to export this stuff to you. So kind of leveraging that symbiotic relationship. So with Microsoft, I worked on a project a few years ago where we were kind of asking the question, how will cloud computing materially impact how we do things in the oil and gas industry and in the energy sector? And then fast forward to Intel, a few years ago, we got a relationship started with similar, same but different. We basically said, how will big data change the contours of the oil and gas sector and the energy sector? And then I recently wrapped up something with Intel looking at blockchain. Again, what can we do in the energy sector with blockchain? By the way, I've got a guest editorial coming up in the December issue of JPT, the Journal of Petroleum Technology, if anyone is curious about that stuff. So again, there's the story. That's why you have in front of you this guy who does a strange amount of thinking about, okay, I've got the background in the oil and gas sector and the energy sector, okay, but I also have really been thinking real hard for the last few years about the digital stuff and kind of looking at how digital technologies are messing with other sectors. And then onward from that, kind of asking the question, okay, well, what can we distill from those other stories? And what useful bits of that can we kind of bring over to the energy sector? Here's one of those 2-liter bottle swigs I warned you about. I told Alf, if I get through the entire bottle by the end, this is a treat before you go home, I'll belch the name of all 50 US states. I won't do that, I'm kidding. All right, so an overview of where I want to go in our time together. First, why do I want to talk about Uber? I want to explain to you why that makes sense. Is this man confused? Why he's coming in here, he's talking about taxi and taxi alternatives, and does he realize this is an energy community? What is with this guy? I want to explain, I want to justify to you why Uber is a conversation that makes sense and is relevant to this crowd. Then I want to kind of pick apart a few of the technological advances that have been unfolding in the larger marketplace. Some of them that are immediately obvious, right in our own neck of the woods, but many of them that have kind of been happening first and most conspicuously elsewhere. And then I want to talk about how those technological advances, what effects have they been having on the value chains and the market structures that they touch. And then I want to try to map that over to what might this mean to the energy sector. I'm very excited to introduce you to somebody here. This is Ravi. Ravi was a taxi driver. I do a lot of traveling in my job. I'm sure a lot of people here are similar in that regard. And Ravi was, he had the distinction of, I just called the taxi company, they sent him, got in the car. Now, maybe you figured out by now, I'm a bit of a chatty guy. Maybe it's because of all the cola. But it's a long drive from where I live in the Gap to the airport. And so just to kind of break the awkward silence, I got a little chatty and started talking to Ravi. And I said, hey, Ravi, listen, I've been doing some thinking and research lately about Uber. And I'm curious, I'm just kind of asking for a man on the street anecdotal impression of this. How has Uber affected you? How has it impacted the day-to-day reality of a taxi driver right here in Brisbane? And he said, well, I'm paraphrasing. He says, 2 years ago, maybe between my gigs, between my jobs, maybe I'd have like a 20-minute wait. And now, only 2 years later, now an hour and a half can go by in between my jobs. And in that only a 2-year span, he has seen that change happen. I thought, well, okay, I mean, we're empiricists, we're engineers, we're numbers people. Maybe I just got unlucky and I happened to climb into the taxi of the grumpiest taxi driver in the world, and the reality isn't nearly as bad as what our friend Ravi there was telling us. Well, so I kind of went back and did a little more research. And here are numbers from the United States, but I don't think that they're too far removed from what's happening in lots of other countries as well. Among the punchlines that I want you to get out of this is that, as recently as 2014, 37% of business travel or ground transportation was happening through taxis. Uber, et cetera, about 8%. In only 4 years, that has completely flipped around. 70.5% are Uber and other ride-hailing services, and the Ravis of the world are now only getting 6% of that market. Turns out Ravi was telling the truth. So we know that that's where the money is not. Do we know anything about where the money is? As a matter of fact, we do. This is from the Financial Times of London. The date on this one is April 26th of this year, only a few months ago. The IPO, the flotation, as it were, of Uber on the market, it had been valued at $91.5 billion with a B dollars. If we kind of do a little thought experiment in our minds too, it's important to kind of ask ourselves, okay, everyone's taking Uber now, and it's literally, it's been verbified. You Uber somewhere. I mean, it's become kind of like this bag. It's like the furniture of our universe. We just treat it like it's always been there. But really, let's do this little thought experiment. How many of us were using it 5 years ago? I mean, the growth rate on this has been exponential. Most of us, I'm just speaking from personal experience, and I expect this is true for most of us, probably most of us hadn't taken it at all 5 years ago. And now we all have, and we all do it on a fairly recurring basis. So I promised you a working definition of what I meant by Uberization, and I'd like to boil it down to a few bullet points here. First of all, we've got digital technologies that have brought about this, what can only be described as a tectonic shift in the profitability and market power within an industry. It only took a few years. It happened that fast. The company that wins often is not an incumbent. It may not even have existed before. And we have these new market leaders jumping up that are playing a digital intermediary role. And they're occupying parts of the value network that are not capital intensive at all. This little guy, this is a fruit fly. And he's a very important talking point for the following reason. So, fruit flies are loved. Any biologists or biochemists in the crowd here? Okay, so fruit flies are kind of like the go-to animal when biochemists want to kind of show phenomena that about DNA and genetics types of phenomena. And the reason that they're so popular for those kind of experiments is because they do something very efficiently. Two things. They live in a very short time span and then they die, right? And so if you want to watch genetic types of phenomena play out, you can kind of watch multiple generations, and each generation only lasts for a few days, and then you move on to the next one. So your whole experiment, multiple generations can expire in the span of days or weeks. It's a manageable time frame. Now, by contrast, if I wanted to ask awkward questions about this gentleman here, why are his eyes the color that they are? Well, I would have to know information about his parents and their parents and their parents. Okay, well, now we've stacked up this living laboratory at 25 years per generation. We could be looking at 75 or 100 years to get to the bottom of why this guy's eyes are the color that they are. Too long. Who's got that kind of time? And the ethics paperwork could kill us, right? Forget that. So, Drosophili, fruit flies. Biochemists love to use them because we can watch the same principles play out, but over an abbreviated time horizon. And I submit to you that that's kind of what we might be talking about here. I submit that that many of the industry dynamics that we see play out in environments and in stories like the Uber situation, that some of them might be salvageable and might also kind of be popping up and playing out also in the energy sector, but at a much slower clip. Now, am I saying for a second that, there's invariably in an energy crowd, at least 20% of the room right now losing their minds because they're thinking the energy is special, it's unique, not every other industry understands its what makes it work and its constraints, and they don't understand what our pain points are. And I get that. I, tongue-in-cheek, kind of refer to that as the snowflake hypothesis. We in the energy sector have I think, a rather unfortunate habit of we think that everything that happens to us is unique and special, and we are like a snowflake, and no one can possibly, nothing that happens in the outside world could be relevant to us. Clearly, that's not true. So the question is, what is relevant? What can map to the energy space? Some of it is mappable, but not all of it is. And I'm also not trying to infuriate my gracious hosts by saying that we don't know how to do innovation and we don't do great work in the energy sector. We absolutely do. Whether we're talking about the green and clean tech people, they've made huge improvements on the efficiency and the price of solar cells, wind turbine markets. These people have been working hard and making huge gains, and we've seen massive things happening also in the more traditional parts of the energy market. This, of course, the Prelude FLNG, it's not outside the Houses of Parliament in London. This is just an artist's rendition, just to give you something to scale it against, so that your eye can go, oh, it's that big. This is a marvel of modern engineering. It has by the way, it's kind of bobbing around off the west coast of Australia. First gas was not too far back. It's producing now, but hasn't been doing it for too long. It is the largest floating object in the history of human civilization. It has the volumetric displacement of 5 United States aircraft carriers. This is something that this industry, that the oil and gas industry has done. It is a feat of engineering by any reasonable standard. So I'm certainly, by the way, even if I said that they just put it there for, to kind of help your eye understand how big this thing was, but even if they did splash it down right in front of Westminster, I think we can agree that that would not be the most strange thing that has happened in Westminster lately. It wouldn't even crack the top 10. I wouldn't even think at this point. I hope that's not a sore point. But huge advances are happening in technology. I'm not saying that the advances aren't happening. Here is the problem. Here is what we should focus on. We do these things, but we do them slowly. What you see here is a stacked bar graph that basically shows you how much time elapses from when Over here you've got, when a new idea is a twinkle in a scientist's eye, until where you have 50% market penetration. And here's the secret that everybody in this room already knows. You can have that humdinger of an idea on your first day on the job, when you first show up for work, and if everything goes perfectly, at your retirement party, as they're handing you your gold watch, your idea has actually got reasonable amount of take-up in the industry around you. That's when everything's going great. That's as fast as we move. We are forever, we are very slow movers. Now, there's a few little bright sparks where we've done better than that, but far more often than not, this is how we act. And there's a lot, I'm not saying that it's not for good reasons. I mean, in an oil and gas setting, there's clearly some safety issues that we have to think very hard about. Words like Piper Alpha in Deepwater Horizon, there's a lot of scar tissue in the industry on account of those disasters. So we are hardwired now to be very cautious and very guarded and measured about the application of new anything. I mean, this is a true story. I don't know if when you were going through EP00, Shell's boot camp, back when the earth was cooling, just like I was. And this is a true story. A Dutch guy named Herman, I remember him saying, he said to the class, with regards to using new innovations, it is usually more advisable, if something goes wrong with that new technology, it is far better for you to read about that failed attempt in a newspaper than in a memo addressed to you. This was his advice. So oil and gas in the industry, the old guard, they were kind of hardwired to, everybody wanted to be either the second implementer or the 22nd implementer. Very few people wanted to be the first user of anything. And they wanted that first user to have had it in the field for about 10 years successfully, and then they would go, all right, now we'll have one. It's hard to make things move fast under those circumstances. So there's the safety thing. We also have in the energy sector, not only in oil and gas and fossil fuels, but in renewables and electricity, et cetera, we have the situation here where it's highly interconnected and a very low tolerance on the part of society for not having the energy that has been promised to them. When we flick that light on, that light switch, those lights better come on. And if it was only available 50% of the time, you would be furious about it, and you'd be, voting out of power whatever government brought about that situation. So we have come to think about energy in a way that we want it to be very safe and very there and very utility-like. And if someone said, yeah, but if you let me play around with some new technologies, and it'll increase the probability that the lights will go out for a while, can you live with that? As a society, we're not very tolerant with that trade-off. So now I'd like to talk about some of the technologies that have been kind of springing up around us and that are starting to change the reality and the landscape of the marketplace around us. One is everybody's got one of these in their pocket. It is an amount of computing power that, even a couple of decades ago, we couldn't even have imagined. We could not have dreamed about how much computing power was going to be at our beck and call, in your pocket, all the time. And then this internet thing, it finally grew up and it reached critical mass. Hey, let's be honest with ourselves. I mean, if you kind of think back to the 90s, the internet, it was cool for, maybe sharing a file here or there, stealing a song, maybe get a video of a cat playing the piano, really stupid, pointless things. It was a parlor trick. Now, it is the backbone of all of our, banking. You use it for mission critical functions in your life. You don't even think twice about it. It's just there. And we have learned to trust it. We treat it like another utility, like we do electricity or water. When you check in at a hotel, how incensed are you when you find out that they don't have free Wi-Fi? It's like asking, do you have flush toilets in this room? Of course they have, right? And this dramatic increase in available computing power. So this graph I'm showing you behind me here, this is known in propeller head types of circles as Moore's Law. Gordon Moore, one of the founding fathers of the Intel Corporation, made the casual observation many years ago. He noticed that the density of transistors that could be shoehorned into an integrated circuit, that density was approximately doubling about every 2 years or so, and that doubling process has continued unabated since the 1970s. That is an incredible trajectory of technological improvement. And we've also seen this precipitous drop in the price of data storage. As you can see here, we are getting to a point where the marginal cost of paying for that next piece of storage capacity, that marginal cost is quickly flirting with zero. Now, if it costs you no money to store all the data that you ever wanted to store, why would you ever throw it away? Why would you ever need to throw data away? If it costs you nothing, there's no opportunity cost, no economic cost with hanging on to just about everything. So you do, throw nothing away. And one of the interesting consequences of this is that the doubling time for all the digital stuff that we have, if you kind of think of this, this bucket of all the digital stuff that we have, and put in that bucket all the video, all the audio files, all the letters to grandma, all of it. Put all of that stuff in a bucket. The doubling time for when do we need another bucket? It's below 3 years, because we're saving everything and we're just collecting everything. And there's so many files being uploaded to YouTube. So the doubling rate is now, or it takes less than 3 years to double it all. By the way, I also want to mention here, I talked about the transistor density thing. Anybody remember from the 90s, Cray supercomputers? Those were like those high-end, like really expensive schnazzy computers they used to use, like physics and mathematicians when they wanted to figure out pi to so many squintillion decimal places. Cray supercomputers. The number of transistors that were in Cray supercomputers is approximately the same number of transistors that you get in an iPad today. That happened. And our friends, the mathematicians, have been working overtime. So it used to be that when we had, we've talked before, Alf and I, about the problem of data and needing clean data so you can kind of do big data and higher levels of analysis with it. We used to need relatively, thoroughly cleaned data so that you could really get serious with the analysis. But what's happened in mathematics is that they have figured out mathematical tools where we can be more tolerant now of spurious data, of incomplete data, of holes in our data, of dirty data. We have algorithms now that do a much better job of scrubbing that stuff than was true only a few years ago. And that is especially germane in an industry like energy. Here's why. Because of the protracted time frames of our industry, a lot of the assets that we have are legacy assets, many of them even that were installed in a pre-digital reality. So a lot of the times if we want to kind of be collecting tons and tons of digital information about something, we have to kind of retrofit all kinds of jewelry on the thing to try to kind of kicking and screaming to drag the stuff into the digital era. But it was never designed that way in the first instance. So because a lot of the digital collection stuff is retrofit, it's not always a perfect marriage of instrumentation and machine. And as a result, we have lots of digital data that it has this, spurious numbers, the holes, incompleteness, dirty data. So as industries go, we suffer from this at least as much as anybody else. And how about that cloud computing? You used to be confined to whatever was on your desk. That's it. That's all you're going to get. And now, if you can get to the internet, you have access to all of the computing power that you can shake a stick at. And you can purchase it in an a la carte fashion for only as much time as you need it. So tomorrow, you could kind of go to Amazon, and literally that's among the largest suppliers of cloud computing capacity in the world. And you could say, I need this much computing capacity, and I only need it for a week. And they'll say, here's how much that'll cost you. And you could have the computing power of NASA tomorrow, and then collapse it down to zero a week after that. That is eminently doable now, and it wouldn't even cost that much. And we've also seen some amazing things happen in terms of society and our relationship with these technologies. We've seen the emergence of digital natives. I watch my children. My eldest is 12. My youngest is 9, and I got one in the middle. And they have such an intuitive, natural relationship with technology that, and I'm not. I'll kind of go down alone on this one. But so I'm 47. Maybe some of you are a little older than that. Some of you are a little younger than that. But I don't think that I have quite the same kind of relationship with the technology that they do. To them, they are digital natives. They can't even conceive of a reality before that. They don't even know what that would look like rotary dial phones, and they know none of that, right? And so they have a very intuitive relationship with this stuff. And now we have this thing with the Internet of Things, where now your refrigerator's in on the conversation. The price of sensors has dropped so quickly that it's very, very cheap and easy to kind of build bridges between the internet, between the digital world and the physical world, so that it's no problem at all to be able to, in real time, have the physical world constantly reporting on the status of whatever it is you want to know about. Your fridge can dial up the local store and say, he's getting a little low on milk. And then the local Kohl's can kind of respond to that and make sure that milk is delivered to you. Your fridge can tell them. They don't need you to tell them anymore. And I just use that as an EG, as an exemplar. But that kind of thing, we now have it so that all manner of things in the physical world can communicate the status of whatever you want to know about them. They can chirp at you in real time and say, this is where that physical parameter is right now. So all of these technologies, one at a time, kind of interesting. When you kind of think about them together, the totality of them, the confluence of these things, it kind of paints a different picture. And I think that it has really done not less than changing the nature of the connectivity of our society and our markets. It has changed fairly fundamentally how people connect to other people. It has changed how people connect to businesses. It has changed how governments connect to citizens. And was that going to have some kind of knock-on effect to value networks? Of course it was. Well, here's what we see happening. I remember Ronald Coase. He won the Nobel Prize in economics. It was somewhere in the 90s, in the mid-90s. And he came up with the theory of the firm. And this kind of connects very usefully to what I say on this slide here. So we have this situation now. We've got all this data sloshing around. And it can be transmitted just as easily to other companies and other people in other places. It could be, for no extra economic cost, I can share digital information with that guy or that guy. I can share it in real time. I can use the internet to do it. It costs me nothing. It takes no extra effort. It's as easy to share with somebody from another company as it is to share with the person down the hall in your own company. It's almost as easy and as quick. So it creates this situation where we have an increased transparency of and accessibility to the inner workings of whatever system you want to share. And that brings about a situation where we have more modularity of architecture. What I mean by modularity is, think of a stereo system. You can kind of take apart all the bits of a stereo system. You could get your speakers from Bose. You could buy, maybe you're into the retro thing. You like kind of records. You've got your turntable. You got a disc player, the radio, and all of these items, they can be purchased from different companies, and you can proudly come back from JB Hi-Fi or wherever you bought this stuff. You can bring it all back to your house, even though all of these bits were from different companies. You can put the stereo together, confident in the knowledge that's going to work just fine. That is a modular architecture. Contrast that to airplane wings, for example. When they design wings for a 737, it's made for that fuselage. They don't rip off the wings off a 737 and put it on an Airbus, or something like that. It doesn't happen. That's an integral architecture. So I'm saying that the increased transparency and accessibility of the data, it kind of creates a condition for more modularity in the system. And here is where that goes. We have this weird situation happening in the marketplace. This weird situation where physical networks can be decoupled from their supporting functions. Check this out. The world's largest transportation company doesn't own any cars. The world's largest hospitality organization doesn't own any beds. And the world's largest retailer doesn't own a store that you can visit. Not at the moment, anyway. So we're seeing this situation where in many industries, sitting on physical assets is far less of a guarantee of profitability and market swagger than it used to. You can have digital intermediaries swoop in from the side. You hadn't even seen them a few years ago, and they're swooping in from the side, and they are garnering for themselves enormous profitability and power at the expense of other parts of the value network that do occupy the physical assets. Again, just to disabuse us of the snowflake hypothesis, oh, that's everybody else's story. That couldn't possibly be happening here. Well, let's check that out. Headline, Wall Street Journal, about a year ago. Silicon Valley to big oil. We can manage your data better than you can. They're not telling you that they're going to get the data that you already have. They know you have it. They're just saying, give it to us. We will tell you what it means. One of the dirty little secrets, another dirty little secret that everybody in the energy sector knows is that, big data, we've been big data for a very long time. We've always collected copious amounts of data in the oil and gas sector. Production data, especially seismic data sets, massive, massive. But we proceed to use 5% of it, or less maybe. There's a lot of it that goes completely unused. And Google's basically saying, you give that to us, we will do a far better job of understanding your digital assets than you do. We're not being invaded, we're inviting them. And I want to dig up a name here. One of the objections that people might have about this is they'll say, they'll never understand the energy sector. We don't have to worry about Silicon Valley, stealing our lunch. Google doesn't understand what it's like to work on a platform and, you know, be out in Roma near the wellhead. They don't know our reality. No, well, they can't buy our culture, but they can rent it. So Google, until very recently, they had a guy named Darrell Willis. He was their VP of oil and gas and energy at Google in California. He learned the craft with BP. He worked for many years with TNK BP, their joint venture in Russia, and elsewhere in the Gulf of Mexico. So, you know, we can't hide behind this, oh, they'll never know our culture, they'll never know our history, they won't have the depth of experience. Yes, they will, because they're going to buy it in. I also kind of want to draw attention to a couple of the other changes we've seen in the industry in the last 2 years. Okay, so GE bought Baker Hughes, and I know I'm telling you what you already know. They are now kind of retreating. It may not, and at the end of it, it may not come to be a full retreat, but they have they've signaled that they're going to unload a lot of their ownership stake of Baker Hughes. But I think, okay, so the decision to buy Baker, that was the strategic part, okay? So by doing that, so GE had this industrial Internet of Things technology platform that they were aggressively trying to kind of make inroads and forays into all manner of industries. They had mining in their sights. They had oil and gas in their sights. They basically were just trying to figure out a strategic way to make sure that we got hooked on their brand of Internet of Things. As we became more digitally savvy, they said, we want to be the person who sells you the digital plumbing to make that possible. The retreating and leaving the oil patch, I don't think that's not driven by strategy. They're having an existential crisis at General Electric. That's why they're having to kind of retreat a little bit. This is about, you know, this is an existential crisis. They're just trying to stay alive. And so I don't think that this retreat from Baker, that's not the strategic part. That's not the part that we should be focusing on the most. And even if GE does retreat, they're not the last one who's going to come knocking. We're going to see more and more of these companies that historically had a nominal presence or no presence in the oil patch, in the energy sector. They are now coming in, okay? The Googles of the world. They weren't really interested in the energy sector until a few years ago. And they're kind of like, wait a minute, we're way better at the data thing than they are. We can show them things with their data that they can't see. And they're now showing up to give us that good news. So we're seeing it in little drips here and there, but this is happening. This is a tsunami now. And I make it sound like it's all the oil and gas thing, but this is also playing out on the renewables and the clean tech parts of the market also. We're seeing new business models happening. The digitally facilitated business models, the rise of the prosumer. So if you've got solar cells on top of your house, you're simultaneously a consumer of electricity and a producer of electricity. So we're giving rise to fancy new words like prosumer. And we've seen this penny dropping for the energy sector. You know, it's been said, so data is the new oil, okay? Data is an asset. Incidentally, that's a part of the title for that work I did with Intel a few years ago. That's the nub of what we're starting to realize. Data is an asset. And the company that has the control, that has the power, it's the company that basically has all the data kind of streaming into it. And it has this Vista-like perspective where it's kind of like, I understand, I know how to make sense of all this data that is streaming into me, and I know what to do next. And the rest of the ecosystem is less aware of what to do next. Companies who fit this archetype are Target, Walmart in the United States, where, sure, their suppliers have some information and some idea what's going on, but that Vista-like mountaintop perspective where you see the whole market and you know exactly what to do next because you see all of the pieces, those huge companies make sure that they are at the center of that. And I think we're starting to see energy companies talk and think like that a little bit more. So, a few parting ideas. I think we can agree, in the wake of the discussion we've had so far, that there's no shortage of digital technologies that are ingressing, that are kind of slowly trickling in, or in some cases that are quickly pouring in to the energy sector. And here is an observation made by a Canadian, a compatriot of mine, Salim Ismail, back when Yahoo was a standalone thing. He made the observation that once you turn something digital, it hops onto that Moore's law, again, that exponential rate of change, that Moore's law pace of change, and it accelerates. And I think that's going to give us a situation where very soon we're going to see this, that staid, conservative, very controlled, measured pace of change that we've been treated to over the last 100 years or so, where we could take our time and don't sweat it. I mean, it's not going to change that fast. I think we're going to see it start to change very quickly, or certainly much faster than most of us ever thought it could. So if you have any questions, I'll do my level best to answer. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. We have a few minutes for questions. If there's anybody, just raise your hand and I'll come to you. Questions for Rob? Gentleman at the back there, just put his hand up.
Thank you for interesting talk. So my question is about Shell and their recent acquisition of ERN Power, the electricity retailer here. They're also Shell Energy in the UK. So just interested in your thoughts on to what extent do you think a big company like Shell might take on some of the ideas that you talked about in moving into the
Yeah.
sector?
So two observations on that one. When I saw that headline, one of the first things that I was reminded of is that we've seen this movie before. I remember in the late 90s when Phil Watts was the CEO of Shell, kind of like this rugby-playing Englishman, and very colorful personality. And I was working in The Hague in the strategy and economics team at that time. And I remember we were kind of putting together these briefing packs, and he had this buzz phrase he was bandying around at the time. He's like, from molecules to electrons, and that whole we make the gas and then we turn it into electricity. I think that integrated value chain has been a part of Shell DNA for a pretty long time. And it maybe kind of went out of style for a little while, but I can tell you from personal experience that model was intact and a real thing even in the 1990s. But it's here again. Now, the whole, I think that Shell among the majors is probably a little ahead. Of course, we would say that, being Shell alumni. But I think that Shell sees that just for reasons of ecology, and kind of it sees the market kind of tipping towards the greener parts of the market. So it's trying to, if you look at its hydrocarbon portfolio, it's more gas heavy. They're kind of getting away. They've unloaded the Athabasca oil sands in Canada because they were too carbon intensive, and so they're moving their portfolio. They've been doing this for years. It's kind of a part of a concerted effort to kind of move in that direction, and to tack on the electricity parts of that. So we've seen it before, and I don't think this is at all surprising. Does that answer that question? Thanks.
I was just going to ask, it seems to me, contrary to all the other things, that the shale gas industry and the coal seam gas industry in the States really took off quickly, and because of the competition and the small players allowed to go, whereas governments stopped them.
Yeah. So the idea, so George Mitchell, he's like the poster child for the shale gale in the U.S. He was the guy who kind of figured out to bring together fracking and horizontal drilling. So George Mitchell was kind of, history's kind of remembering him as the guy. He worked for one of the independents in the heartlands of the U.S., and he kind of was the first guy to really be bullish about that stuff. And there's this historian, D.D. Hinton, at the University of Texas at Tyler, and D.D. Hinton has the title of one of her papers where she kind of carefully, meticulously documents George Mitchell's journey as he was kind of making the unconventionals miracle happen. We only saw a small sliver of time and went, oh my gosh, it's an overnight miracle. She called the title of that paper, George Mitchell and the 14-year overnight miracle. It was culminating it was kind of gestating over a very protracted period of time that looked a lot more like my stacked bar chart. The whole half a career goes by. Yeah, that happened there too. It's just that we weren't paying attention. Yeah.
Just a quick question. And you were talking about sort of the shell model, vertically integrated from gas to electrons type approach to their business thinking.
Yeah, that was Phil Watts in the 90s that I was talking about. Yeah.
Are they the companies that are kind of at risk here as the technology evolves, as the information, as the transaction costs between the different components of the industry sort of are reduced by the availability of all this data? Is it, the gentellers in the electricity industry and the big vertically integrated Exxons and that Shell that should be worried here, or
right.
do you think they can benefit from this?
Well, certainly in the retail side of things, we've seen this explosion, this proliferation. I mean, how many options do we have to procure fuel and electricity in the retail market? I mean, I can't even name them all. I mean, there's been this crazy number of options now, right? And I don't even know how they differentiate themselves anymore. So on the retail end, that's definitely happened. But at the same time, too, the whole large integrated value network, if you kind of think about, why does a company like Shell still, pride itself in having that large integrated chain, especially on the gas side? If you kind of look at how LNG happens, you've got the upstream, you've got the midstream, you've got the downstream, you're kind of selling it and turning it into electricity. We've got even another part of the chain now. And why the LNG value chain makes sense to the IOCs so much is, honestly, it's where NOCs can't get to. An NOC can't make that value chain that spans to the other side of the ocean and you can sell it to customers on the other side. NOCs can't go there. So IOCs have loved that highly integrated, very vertical chain because it's where a lot of the rest of the market can't play.
So they've kind of locked in the assets that allow the delivery from the wellhead to the consumer. Is that kind of their strategy? It's the strategy that made them do what they've done to get to this point. I guess what I'm challenging that with here is, will that continue to be robust indefinitely into the future? I have doubts about that. I think that people are going to start chiseling away at different parts of these huge integrated value networks, and they're going to find clever ways. Kind of like right now, we just see the symptom of this happening on the retail side of it, where, maybe 10 or 20 years ago, maybe there was only like three companies that would sell you electricity, or three companies that would sell you LPG. And then now, like I said, I can't even name them all. So maybe we're going to see more competition coming in the value network in different parts that would have been categorically impossible before these digital technologies.
With regard to your stacked bar chart,
Sorry.
How slow market penetration is in the oil and gas sector? How
Yep.
do you think it affects thinking of companies like Shell with regards to scenario planning? Because considering that this change is so slow,
Yeah.
and then they do all the wacky stuff like sky scenarios and ocean scenarios.
Yeah. Wow, you know your stuff. So I was with the scenarios team in the 90s for a while, in between London and The Hague. And so I know the job of scenarios isn't to accurately predict the future.
The job of the scenarios is basically to come up with internally consistent narratives about the way that the world could play out. That I'm trying to make like I don't have the benefit of a huge whiteboard here, so go with me on this. Imagine like I'm trying to make up like two perpendicular lines, 90 degrees, kind of like with my arms here. And so what you're trying to do is kind of come up with this plausible story about, okay, with the market forces and the societal forces that we see unfolding, that could go this way, or it could go that way. And we'll kind of treat those like reasonable boundary conditions. Now, the logic for shell scenarios is that not only is the future unknown, but it is unknowable, especially over time horizons of decades. There's just no way you can know. But if I go with that scenario and test my business model, is my business robust under those conditions? Okay, it'll last. How about this? How about those business conditions? Would my business survive under those conditions? Yes, it would. Okay, now the reality is it'll happen somewhere in the middle. I don't know where, but it'll be somewhere in the middle. But if I'm good over here and I'm good over here, I'll probably be okay in the middle. That's what scenarios do. It was never being about going, this is the future. That's too bold. It's a defensive strategy to test it with alternative realities to make sure that you're still robust.
Thanks for the talk, it was very good.
Thanks.
A particular slide you got to in the middle about the smart grid.
Yeah.
Questions around there instead of about Shell. In my view, the two big barriers to adopting that sort of prosumer entity in Australia at the moment are widespread adoption of time of use meters, and secondly, charging network tariffs based on the energy consumed as opposed to on a demand basis, a maximum demand basis.
Okay.
And the barriers to those two things are all social and political. And I was just interested if there's any of all the technological forces and drivers that you see as actually helping overcome those social and political barriers. The technology at the moment is all
Yeah. So I don't have the silver bullet answer to address. So how do we win society over? How do we win the hearts and minds, even though the technology is ready? So that is also the lot of the electric vehicle crowd. There's plenty of things out there where if we could just convince everybody, hey folks, this is the way to go. All the things that would be possible. I don't have a canned response ready to go on that one. You're right. That's the tough job. And you know what? It's also the job that propeller head engineers. I'm a mechanical engineer by background. It's what we are always guilty of. We think that if we build it, they will come. If we come up with a technologically elegant solution, that surely our job here is done, and it never is. It's always about the hearts and minds, and we always forget that part. It's who we are. Yeah.
Question at the back. That's a shout.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of, I'd almost characterize that. It sounds like more of a downstream thing. And it sounds entirely plausible, but I don't know enough about that for me to give you the kind of, if I did try to answer the question, we'd both be poorer for the experience. So I'll just do us both the courtesy of, I just won't. Sorry.
I can comment a little bit on that.
Oh, here we go.
So it's very well as long as a very small number of people play the game. So there's a finite energy mix, the second law of thermodynamics behind it. So you can't have everybody change due to the most favorable technology without supply and cost, right? So long as it's a minority game, you can put everything out and people can choose the favorites. But when it comes down to the whole bloody society doing it, everybody can't choose a windmill, or everybody can't choose a solar panel. So you end up with physical constraints underneath these fancy data. There are still physical constraints that need to be, which we haven't got to the bottom of. It actually comes back to your point is there's some physical constraints, and we're not prepared socially to put up with the light. What did you say when you put the switch, the lights don't go on? That's what we seem to be struggling with.
Yeah.
We want all of the nice, let's say, the reduced emissions outcomes, but we're not prepared to put up with any of the reduced availability or increased cost outcomes.
Look at that.
Until we can get over that sort of base, then we're sort of being virtuous, but not doing very much. I'm a cynic. I am a cynic. Sorry. With that, we're going to carry on the conversation, but I think there are drinks at the back of that, Christine.
Oh.
If Christine's not drunk them already. There are
Yeah.
drinks there in the,
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
and I think
Thanks.
thanks again for Rob.
That's about the most questions we've had.